and when the word peaceful, we think of economic interdependence. So the academia sort of follows these trends. So I never used to encourage my students to get too deeply involved in this compartmentalization of the international theories. Let me tie another approach completely and really attack the title of the conference. Elaborate on it. Global New World Order. It's true, and we've all said this at one time or another, that the end of the Cold War led to a different kind of world. But I think there were other factors which have really changed the world even more than perhaps the end of the Cold War, and particularly technology change. I spent the last 10 years of my life doing pro bono stuff for the National Academy of Science, meeting with Indians and Chinese and Russians about technology and politics and strategy. And I think that, except for Professor Legro, who I guess is gone, nobody's mentioned nuclear weapons. And that's one of the technologies which really changes the way that countries, whether nuclear or non-nuclear, do business. No nuclear country can attack another nuclear country, basically. And that's been true from the first days of the nuclear era. In a sense, Ken Waltz's vision has come true. With all the qualifications, they have to be responsible nuclear weapon states. But General Sunderji said to me after the Pakistanis tested, he said, we're never going to have a war with Pakistan. And I think all Indians and all Pakistanis agree. You could have a mistake, an accident, but the issue is nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. How do they relate? How does Russia relate? So maybe the Soviet Union relate to Ukraine, or China relate to other countries. In a sense, it's changing the rules of the world because you cannot imagine escalation between two nuclear weapon states. You can imagine it, but you don't want it to happen. So in other words, the basic assumption under which most policymakers operate have been transformed. That's why the Iranians want to join that club. It's a different kind of rule set. Secondly, there is what we call I heard on Lillehammer, the program on Netflix, the interweb. All this combination of new technologies which makes any peasant in Hyderabad or any citizen of Hyderabad have better technology than I had when I was in the State Department. In other words, he can surf the world, he can talk with anybody in the world. I couldn't do that in the State Department, and neither could the Shaper. In other words, this technology has super empowered individuals, good and bad. And one group that's super empowered are terrorists, and that presents a second new kind of military threat. So the world is faced with not only wholesale war and a large scale nuclear weapons and nuclear war, but also retail violence. Individual bombs and terrorists inspired and influenced by the web, learning from the web how to do this. So that's the second technology. Other two technologies are important, but not central, I think, to the transformation to this new world order. One is container ships. Container ships enable China, because it took advantage of this quickly, to become the global manufacturing company. So the Chinese and now the Indians can compete in Peoria and Des Moines with American tractor companies easily, and they do it all the time. So it's possible to manufacture something anywhere in the world and ship it to any other place in the world fairly cheaply. Transportation is not a major cost. And finally, wide bodies just move people around very quickly. So in summary, you have the movement of people, ideas, things, and destruction on a scale unimaginable 30, 40, 50 years ago. Well, few people imagine it, but now we have it. So to me, this raises 4 or 5 different research questions. And at a university, I think it's appropriate to raise it. At Brookings, you can't do this kind of thing. They're dealing, in a sense, policy day by day. One is, what do we mean when relations between two countries are good or bad? That is, how do you measure analytically the so-called ups and downs? And I got so tired of reading the ups and downs between the U.S. and India or China and India that I initiated a little research project at Brookings which went nowhere. But in fact, it's possible to do it, and nobody's ever done it. You get 5 or 6 different measures plus 25 indicators, sort of quantifying the measurement of relations between two states. And so that's a whole area that I think academia sort of ignored. Maybe somebody's done this. I checked with Paul Deal. He knew nothing about this. Secondly, what is the impact of technology? And what would be the impact of technologies which are just coming on stream now in the future? Who would have said 5 or 10 years ago that America would become the world's largest natural gas producer because of shale oil? It's astonishing. That changed. Now India's going to be a large purchaser from us. Other countries will. That sort of changed the energy situation in the world enormously. And so America's decline all of a sudden is no longer decline because we converted this technology into energy. And what other technologies are going to merge in the future? In a sense, that's what I think a study of the global order needs to include. Thirdly, we haven't talked about important third countries. in particular Japan perhaps, but also Pakistan central. Japan is obviously India's major obsession. Was a close ally of ours at one time, but no longer. And of course, China is Pakistan's leading ally, or that it's a superficially close relationship. So what's the Pakistani role in this? Could they start a nuclear war between India and China? Is their nuclear arsenal going to grow to the point where it's bigger than the Chinese? I mean, all these things are possible. So a conference like this should, in a sense, take account of mysterious third countries, especially Pakistan, but maybe even Japan. Fourthly, and these are more policy-related issues. How do you predict a response to a crisis in a changing world, where everything, all the rules are changed? That is, if there should be another 1962, will the Americans come to India's aid? If there should be another Cargill, will the Americans side with the Indians again? If Pakistan should collapse, what will we do? What will the Indians do? What will the Chinese do? And these are uncertain. These are all developments that happened in the past. They will happen in the future in one form or another, which they will. So in this sense, policymakers need to think about this. Well, they can't and they don't. This really should be the job of their intelligence operations, but they don't. So these are issues. What are the known unknowns for the future? And you use models in the past. Finally, what is the meaning of an ally? We're talking about alliances and relationships and close partners, and of course all of this comes out of the term, what was the U.S.-India term? Natural ally. What's the difference between a natural ally and an unnatural ally? I mean, when do you... A treaty. Well, when does a commitment? And sometimes treaties are ignored. And how do you interpret these treaties? So our relationship with China, with Pakistan, with India, all very indeterminate. And I think it largely depends on the administration in power, how they imagine the relationship with those countries, and especially if there's a conflict between any two of those parties. That's I'm anti.
Oh, well, my gosh, you want a couple more minutes?
No.
No, wonderful.
I think I've provoked enough.
We are ahead of time. Let's open it up to the floor and get some further discussion points, and maybe hopefully get some across the table kind of discussions going. Well?
Just a comment. I was really, as a fan of the rebalance policy, I'm really interested in sorting out what to think about the rebalance in India, because we have these two pretty different perspectives here on one. The first was wariness and the other on the Indian part, and the other was not. And so I'm not sure I mean, the three of you have gotten together and talked about this, but to me, this is a very important finding, one way or the other. And I think it's probably a pretty important element of the book. I don't know, and not that everybody should agree, but I just find this as it's an interesting split here.
Yes.
Just on this question of the rebalance, because it also brings the triad in. There wasn't one Indian view on the rebalance. There were phases of it, and even within those phases, there were different constituencies within the Indian government, not outside, because frankly speaking, the strategic elite that is outside has, other than a few specific people, limited impact on how the government is necessarily seeing these things. And the first phase you saw was people trying to figure out what the rebalance was. But a lot of interest in it at a time when the US did not articulate very clearly that India was part of it. Pivot was announced when it was still a pivot. At that point, there were questions. And this came in the context not of the maritime disputes that are coming now, but the first period of kind of assertiveness that in India was called aggressiveness, as it was in other parts of Asia. And so there was interest for change being part of something, but in the sense of using the US to warn China off. So very much the offshore balancer being part of India's strategy to deal with China. And that lasted about from that 2008 to that 2010 period, where you did see a reaction, not just in India, but other countries, to make the pivot even possible, kind of welcoming an Asian version of empire by invitation. And then you see this kind of change over time where, again, you start to see okay, yes, we want that, but as the reaction to the rebalance came from China, which was, no, no, don't join up with the US, we have benefits to offer you as well. It was again the, let's not kind of go back, get too close to the US so it doesn't damage our relations with China. And then you again saw, when the maritime dispute started, questions again, are we part of the strategy? Then you see all the comments about linchpin, etc. But then now you have the question in India, which you have in pretty much most of the Asian countries that aren't China, which is what happened to the rebalance? Where is the rebalance? They were talking about economic, and there's concerns, for example, where does India fit into the TPP, the economic side of the rebalance as well? And so there are all these, it's pretty interactive. There hasn't been a static view. And the other question that you will get, and you will get this from policymakers in India who will say, not just what happened to the pivot, but we thought that we had an understanding in the Asia Pacific, the US and India had an interest, and a common interest in ensuring that China does not emerge as the dominant power in Asia. What happened to that? How can we ensure that doesn't happen in a way that is harmful to interest? And this is where the Indian concerns about G2 come in. So I think it's fairly interactive, and so I'm not sure there's any one view at any given time. It is actually quite interactive, partly because we're in the middle of it.
Cool.
I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about what you said with the U.S. naval strategy and Indian perceptions of that. Do they think there has been a change? Do they welcome it? Because there has been some, and it's kind of almost more tactical and operational level, but Pacific Command has talked about sort of a rebalance, and the type of ships, basically the most advanced destroyers and things like that, are now being shifted to 7th Fleet to do these sort of operations. And I'd like to hear a little bit about how that's perceived in India.
Great. Well, let me, oh, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Tezi, I was hoping you could elaborate the phrase you mentioned towards the end, in which you said I think you were referring to India's sort of changing economic profile and greater dynamism since the reform period. You said something about emphasize or de-emphasize the strategic side, and it seems to me the thing that is one of the themes from the morning is the link between the political economy side and or low politics side and the high politics geopolitical side. That was your reference to that. I was wondering if you could elaborate that.
I'm going to add a couple of things on my own, and then we can turn it back to the group and then maybe get even more questions, because we still got about 25 minutes. One of the things that I think is interesting about the relationship with India and the U.S. vis-a-vis China is that the Chinese, as I perceive them, have a good interest, as I've said before, in appearing to be relatively moderate, a reasonable actor, one that's tied into the international system through institutions and the WTO and so forth, so that it can have this peaceful rise and just grow and grow and grow until it's, perhaps a dominant state. But what it also is perceiving, which is a natural thing a rising state would perceive, is that the declining state has an incentive to start shifting moderately towards a preventive containment kind of logic. Now, I say moderately because it's not what the U.S. did from 45 to 47, but this pivot or this rebalancing has a flavor, maybe a scent of balancing behavior, by definition, I suppose, but containment. And at least, the Chinese say it's part of containment. It's not really, of course, not at all like the Cold War. But what's interesting about that is how China has incentives to respond to that, not by counter-containment or counter-aggressive or assertive policies per se, but indeed by, again, creating these economic linkages to countries like India, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Russia, Africa, but focusing on India, creating a relationship economically with India where the Indians have, like Taiwan, a new interest in being cooperative with China. And obviously, by definition, or not necessarily by definition, by implication, by not necessarily getting too close to this rebalancing, pivoting action of the U.S. And so I, again, being cynical or perhaps just simply trying to introduce the geopolitical side to all of this, I see China's strategy, this idea of now promising a whole bunch of investment to go along with the trade, and that way if you're worried about this deficit, don't worry too much because we're going to invest heavily. It's promises, I know, mostly. But it makes perfect geopolitical sense as well in keeping India tethered to the China, what I would call the hub, and they would be another one of the spokes. Now here's where I think Hirschman, back in 1945, had a great insight. We often call it in political science the Hirschman effect. He was talking about Nazi Germany doing this with Eastern Europe prior to the war, where Germany creates these, individualized bilateral economic relationships with Eastern European states that are supposedly free and independent, but by that very relationship between a very dominant economic hub and a spoke, or in this case, smaller states, those smaller states feel compelled politically, diplomatically, to align towards that center of that metropole. So in this sense, I think, I see again, and I'm interested to see what people think of this, I see again China's strategy towards India, and I would predict this, therefore, that China is going to definitely push this India-China economic relationship precisely to reduce the likelihood of any effective counterbalancing a coalition, India being a very big pivot. And indeed, maybe it even convince the Indians, with their very strong navy, not to worry too much if maybe a few Chinese naval ships come in to the Indian Ocean to protect, against piracy, or help out with Somalia, or help out with the very tricky Persian Gulf problem, and so forth. So again, cynically, I see China as not only trying to create that relationship with China, but doing it for very good counterbalancing reasons. All right, so do you guys want to respond to the questions that have been
Why
posed?
don't we start at this end this time?
Sure.
And most of the questions are on the rebalance in one way or another, so that's what I'm going to focus on. I think that Tanvi's comment was particularly useful because it introduces the idea that the rebalance didn't start the first time an administration official said pivot and then pivoted off to calling it a rebalance. The U.S. view on what they needed to think about when considering strategy in Asia had been edging over towards including the Indian Ocean for quite some time. And in that sense, India was always part of that. What made that kind of thinking possible was really two things. One was just the end of the Cold War, so that India was not linked to the Soviet Union, which in turn was clearly a rival of the United States. But also was India's more confident view of its own neighborhood. One of the big drivers of Indian policy has always been the determination to retain primacy in the region. India used to be quite prickly about the naval presence in the Indian Ocean. And I remember there was a conference between the two national defense universities. This must have been in 1990, and then there was another one in 1991. And on both of those occasions, the guys in the white uniforms were the ones who were most intensely suspicious of each other. And it wasn't at all subtle. I mean, you could see it in the body language. It was really kind of awful. The navies are now the two closest services, service to service. And you don't get prickly Indian statements about what is the U.S. Navy doing in the Indian Ocean anyway. You get a certain amount of prickliness sometimes around port visits, but that's just pushing the old buttons and the bad old days and the kind of thing that Howie was talking about, which is still in the DNA. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a different kettle of fish altogether. This is essentially a free trade area-like organization. The Indians do not have hurt feelings about not being part of that discussion. They're terrified that they will be asked to be part of the discussion because the politics of opening up trade in India is, if possible, even worse than the politics of doing that in the United States. India's views on the U.S. naval strategy, I'm not aware if they're having commented a whole lot on the U.S. naval strategy, but the fact that they basically and quietly view the U.S. Navy as a benign presence in the Indian Ocean at the moment is certainly a big indicator. How do economic relations impact on the strategic relationship? I obviously didn't say this very well, but let me take another cut at it. When the U.S. goes after India or the European Union or Japan over Japan's import restrictions on beef and oranges, over restrictions on wine, over agricultural policy, over intellectual property rights, it tends to be the result of lobbying by the U.S. industry and a U.S. legal framework that very much pushes the U.S. government to throw the book at foreign competitors who are deemed to be playing dirty pool. It is very difficult to use strategic arguments to push back against that kind of initiatives, and I saw this happen during the 4 years that I was working on trade. In that sense, normal U.S. trade policy, and I'm drawing a distinction between that and what we did to the Soviet Union in the bad old days, is not an outgrowth of strategic policy, except in the broadest sense that having a rule-bound international trade system is something that strategically worked for the United States. But when you have a bilateral problem with a country that has a great big economic relationship with the United States, that is going to have an impact on how much effort the U.S. government puts into solving the bilateral problem. I mean, operationally, that's how it shows up. I haven't thought about this in theoretical terms. I can't put an elegant explanation around it. But that's the dynamic I see at work. Dale, I think there's a lot to your argument about what Chinese strategy might be. I mean, I'm not a China person, so you may not think my view on that is that important, but I think, and there's always been a China factor in the improved U.S. relationship with India. At the start, and I'm talking not so much about the Clinton as about the George W. Bush administration, it was explicitly in their thinking. It was not explicitly in the public explanation of any of this. India and the United States waited a very long time before the word China escaped their lips in any context in which they were talking about India-U.S. relations. The Indians were paranoid about not appearing to be part of the U.S. strategy. And that, I think, is a lot of what is driving this ambivalent feeling. The Indians recognize that their interests and ours work close together. They don't want to be seen to be playing a U.S. game. And I think that really is the answer to the question that Bob Sutter raised. I could go on at length about this, but I won't unless somebody else wants to.
Other individuals who want to jump in, or Deepa, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Actually, let me take off from Casey's last point, but bringing it back to the rebalance where the questions raised. Few things. One, the way in which I approached the rebalance was as to demonstrate theoretically, to pit sort of realism and interdependence against each other. And so I was not so much interested in looking at a policy as it evolved over time, rather to get a sense of what some expectations might be and what did we get. And so in that sense, what's also interesting is the fact that, yes, there were discussions, about the rebalance, and I think the discussions went far beyond what you might think, because I think not just the government, the media discussed it. It was a lot of public intellectuals were talking about it, and I think even the government's reluctance to adopt it and this fairly negative public discourse has an impact. Because what it does is it constrains policymakers. It's not rhetoric for rhetoric's sake. I think that they were forced to say that in part because of domestic constituencies. And then you are constrained by what you say. And so that's one.
Just some two-finger on this, Deepa. I mean, I guess I'm trying to I disagree with the idea that they didn't adopt this, the rebalance. After all, if you look at what India did in that time, for example, for a country that has historically been very concerned about China perceiving it as doing anything that would seem like balancing against it. For India to publicly agree and participate in a US-Japan-India trilateral,
Yes.
or for example, to have the maximum number of military exercises with the US, in which Japan, for example, is invited, etc. I would see, this is not signing up to a deal as such, but I would see this very much as moving towards the US on some of these aspects.
But that's been happening since 2002, though. I'm just specifically focusing on this. I mean, what you're saying is correct, that US and India have obviously moved much closer to each other that Tazy was talking about. After the end of the Cold War, they've had a lot of movement that they didn't in the past, and so it's had a very good relationship. That's not at all what I'm disagreeing about. But India has also, in 2007, they had quadrilateral exercises with Australia, Japan, US, and India. Naval exercises, that was a very big deal because of the fact that they've never done that. But at the same time, they stopped that for almost 5 years because of pushback from China and the fact that India thought maybe they had gone too far, and they didn't do it until very recently again, and without Australia. So it's not that there's a continuing policy that's definitely marked out. The other thing is, on the rebalance, there was one question that on the US, and that is, the rebalance was questioned because the issue was, is the US a declining power or not, largely put, okay? So, is this a way in which the US is basically trying to offload responsibility, and if in fact the US is, how reliable is the US going to be? That was a big issue, and I think that's a big question. For example, if India signs on publicly to the rebalance and then provokes down the road, you provoke China, is the US going to come back in? I mean, can India depend on the US for what kind of support? So I think there was that kind of debate. There was a question whether, the other question is, of course, back with strategic autonomy, is India going to get dragged into conflicts that it doesn't want to get dragged into with China by signing up on this? And the Chinese did make démarches to India on this. And in fact, the way in which India responded was literally soon after the Chinese sort of a kind of concern, the Indians made yet another statement that we want to have a multilateral approach, or India-China bilateral approach to these issues and so forth.
Let's get John
Could
involved.
I-
Can I have a word?
Well, I think these are all on the same issue, are they not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This is
so,
on-
but I just want to get some new people as well, and we'll go this way, is that all right? Because you're all, I think, two fingers, as we say in the field, that means you're on this issue, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and John, are you on this
So
issue?
mine's a one finger.
Okay, okay, let's go this, okay, good.
Could
Let's
we
go this.
clarify
He
what
hasn't
what the
spoken.
disagreement is? I believe there's a disagreement between Tanvi and Deepa, and I'd just like to
My-
be really clear on what that is.
Well, my point is that I think that if you use, and I have to come back to the theoretical model here, because that's the conference's objective rather than, exactly the policy. But what I'm saying is that if you have a realist expectations on this particular policy is a good test case, and I don't think it delivered what would have been expected. In fact, I think it's quite tepid. Now, if you have to, if there is some, there is obviously some welcoming of a higher role for India. The concept of seeing the Indo-Pacific as one strategic concept is very welcome, because India wants to be in the game. All
Okay.
right? But so being
Well,
invited to the party, he doesn't want to be a party spoiler, but on the
Yeah.
other hand, he doesn't also want to be.
We've only
seen
got
as a,
5 minutes or so,
Take
so you
1
can keep your, what?
Take 1 minute.
Well, yeah, but we're going to go this way, okay? So-
Okay. I wonder whether we've paid enough attention, may not have paid any attention, to cultural issues. And the fact that the United States and India now seeing by each country in a much different way than has been the case in the past. That the United States, which is unpopular in many foreign countries, is now quite popular in India. Huge numbers of Indians come to the United States for education. We've set up multi-million commissions and committees. Indians travel to the United States, and U.S. people go to India. What is the relationship with China?
All right.
How many Indians go to universities in China? How many Chinese come to India? Is China
I'm just gonna stop because we've only got about 4 minutes, and I've got 4 people.
Can I finish one
Okay, sure.
sentence? Also, there is still, in the Indian view, an important part of their territory held by the Chinese. I'll stop there.
Okay, good. So just keep it to less than a minute.
I'm wondering, listening to this conversation, whether we have a case that the rebalance works pretty well in practice, but less well in theory.
All right.
Yeah, I've always regarded the rebalance as a way of disguising a limited defeat in the Middle East, because the U.S. Army, the Marines, everybody wanted out of the Middle East. For them, it was a disaster. They want to rebuild their military along different lines and face the Soviets once again, or at least the Chinese, if not the Soviets. From the Indian point of view, moving towards China was good, but moving out of Afghanistan is bad. The Indians are terrified as to what's going to happen in Afghanistan, to them as well as to Pakistan. So from their point of view, I realize from their calculation of senior policy people, they like the rebalance in theory because it moves us towards China. But their real strategic problem is Pakistan and Islamic extremism coming in from the West, not China. China is a long distance problem.
Right. Matt and then John.
So one of the things that I keep thinking about when we're talking about realism and its expectation is what exactly are the predictions that realism will make here. In particular, I'm thinking in the context of the split between internal and external balancing. So this is something that I'm actually very interested in the context of India and vis-a-vis China, insofar as what we seem to be seeing is, if anything, internal balancing really what's going on. We have an expansion of the Indian Navy, we have expansion of the missile systems, but in terms of external balancing, alliance building and whatnot, that's what's not happening. So that's the real puzzle to me, because you can hide external balancing, saying that it's for political reasons or whatever it may be, but internal balancing, when you're just building up, that's harder to falsify and say, oh, it's for this other reason. There's usually only a particular kind of reason that you're doing that for, especially when you're talking about, in this case, naval resources that can't be used in the same way against Pakistan as against China, and missile systems that now can reach any part of China and don't do you any extra good against Pakistan. So to me, that's something that I would.
Interesting. Okay.
want
John?
to know more.
Okay, just a quick set of comments. I really like Deepa's paper, and I really am glad that she took it upon herself to do this comparative work. And I just wanted to suggest a framing for it, because it strikes me it's really quite a paradox. That is the argument that India's relations with the United States show greater nationalism than with China. And the paradox is this: India has fought a war with China. India has an ongoing border dispute with China. So you would think they would have a much more nationalist response.
Yeah.
And so, the question is why, and that's interesting. But I did want to comment, because I often find your work to be very stimulating, and I often agree with it when you talk about sort of these different strains of discourse. But I also often find myself asking, okay, so why did these changes take place? And sometimes it's not clear to me. The second comment I wanted to make was on rebalancing. And this is a sort of a unit of analysis question. And so it's directed to Tanvi and to Deepa, but also to Dale, in the sense that, so if we're talking about rebalancing, we're talking about at least 3 parties here: the United States, India, and China. And I really like the idea that Tanvi pointed out, that you get this sort of strategic interaction going on, right? So my question is this: so what is the proper unit of analysis in that case? Is it a bilateral sort of situation? Can we understand it in that way, with one country exogenous? And if that's the case, which country is exogenous in that relationship? So it strikes me like that's a case, a very important case for us to make, that we want to go beyond bilateral relationships, because the world's gotten more complex. And finally, I wanted to, I think I really appreciate Steve's provocative comments, and I wanted to ask one question, which is, Steve made a list of different questions we should ask. One of them is, how do you predict crisis in a changing world? And the other one is, what is the meaning of an ally? And this came up earlier in Bob's comments too. And I'm just wondering, if you think about what it means to be an ally now, or what we try to define as an ally now, as opposed to, let's say, during the Cold War, it is very clear to me it's much more complex, much more difficult to know. It's a more complicated meaning to somehow be aligned with somebody. And I'm just drawn back to the thought that a lot of that has to do with changes in the global economy, greater interdependence, greater economic interdependence. So is China sort of a rival, or can we work together with China? A lot of that has to do with our very complicated economic relationship with China. So that, once again, sort of takes me back to this idea that interdependence is important.
Well, let me use the last minute, if I can, just to perhaps help the discussants, or not the discussants, the paper writers with some framework questions here. The way I see the problem with the papers presented is that we've largely got a description of what's happened over time, and perhaps even a disagreement on what's actually happened, but we don't have a lot of good explanations for why, as John pointed out, India would have a sort of a different attitude towards the U.S. with nationalists, if you will, and driving the cart, versus China, with liberals driving the cart. There's no good explanation right now for this, and indeed, what I would suggest is that think of it as a square, where on one of the scales you've got India's relationship, let's say, to the U.S. Is it distant or is it close? And it's a spectrum. It's not an either or. It's a spectrum. Close would be obviously full-blown alliances, but something in between is somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Then on this scale, we have India's relationship with China, and that could go close to distance. So you again have a spectrum, and then you have a kind of a conceptual space you can actually plot over time, eyeballing it, if you will. Back in the 60s, it was a distant relationship with both. Then it moved a little bit more towards, perhaps maybe towards a close relationship with the U.S., but not yet with China. And then it moved more close towards China. And that shifting over time towards the close high box over here would actually suggest, there's a lot to be explained here, but we haven't got any explanations. And what I also want to suggest is, this is relative to Deepa's paper, is that we shouldn't just say, well, because I see a certain behavioral shift, I have to therefore assume that the nationalists win out, or the realists don't win, or because realism, first of all, is a very contested paradigm, and there are certain realists who would have probably pretty good explanation for why maybe India didn't just jump into the rebalancing paradigm framework. And indeed, one of the defensive realist logics would be you don't just instantly jump into a counterbalance against a China when China has a lot of leverage over you. So that power political relationship is important. So again, we shouldn't just say, well, the behavior was this, therefore realism wins or liberals win. Indeed, I would again make an argument that realist logic, I'm not trying to favor realism, I'm just saying that realist logic could explain why India wants a really good economic relationship with China, but I think the nationalists could also have a relationship. If we get a better tie with China going, we use that as leverage against the U.S. in our relationship. So I'm suggesting this conceptual framework that allows us to pinpoint and describe the changes, but once you've described the behavioral changes, that's only the first step. Then you have to explain them. And then in explaining them, remember that the classic phrase is, every good theory should explain both ends of the dependent variable. So realism just doesn't explain force and aggression. Realism explains peace, so does liberals. Liberals also explain war. So each of these paradigms, including the identity paradigm, should be able to explain both ends of the dependent variable and therefore changes along the spectrum. And then you can have a good fight. You can have a good theoretical fight or explanatory fight, really, on explaining these changes over time. All right? So I took an extra 2 minutes. But said I wouldn't do that. No one stopped me, though. Okay, so I guess we'll break, and let's thank everybody for